Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to our Brown Bag Lecture Series. We are thrilled to have Bill Convery from the State Historical Society here with us today. Before we get started, I do want to go over some upcoming programs. First of all, next week, the Brown Bag Lecture will be Bill McKelvey reminisces about teaching in public schools in Steamboat Springs. As well, next week on Thursday, July 30th, we'll be doing a family scavenger hunt of downtown historical buildings. Come over to the museum, pick up your scavenger hunt between 4 and 6, go around the downtown and answer the questions on the scavenger hunt, come back for prizes and refreshments anytime before 7. So we hope to see you all for that. We've also been doing tours at the Historic Mesa School all week. All summer, I should say. We did one last week. We've got 2 coming up in August. One is Saturday, August 1st, from noon to 2 p.m. That's the Red School, just about at the base of Rabbit Ears Pass. We're doing another one on Thursday, August 20th, from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And as most of you know, we are doing weekly walking tours. We have our Mineral Springs walking tour every Tuesday throughout the summer from 9 to 10:30 a.m. That meets over at the depot. We have our Olympic Heritage Walking Tour that meets over at House and Hill from 9 to 10:30 a.m. is every Wednesday. And then we also have our Downtown Historical Walking Tour that meets at the museum that runs every Thursday from 9 to 10:30 a.m. And, of course, our Brown Bag Lecture Series is every Friday at noon in July and August. So, I'm Candace Lombardo. I want to personally welcome you all here to the museum. I'm the Executive Director. Thrilled to bring to you Bill Convery from the State Historical Society.
Thank you, Candace. And thank you all for inviting me to come up and speak today. Can you hear me okay in the back? All right. I want to make sure. And if you can't, yell anytime. Okay. My name is Bill Convery. I'm the state historian at the Colorado Historical Society. And Candace graciously invited me to come up today and speak to you. I have an ulterior motive. Some colleagues of mine who are sitting in the back from the State Historical Society were very interested in seeing what Candace was doing at the Steamboat Spring, at the Tread of the Pioneers Museum. And I have to say we are extremely impressed with the programs that you're putting on. Exhibits at the end.
Thank you.
It's a terrific job. And we're just so thrilled to see the interest in your heritage and your history in this community. It's what we like to promote at the Colorado Historical Society, and it's just great to see the turnout here today and all that you're doing. Candace invited me to speak today about the White River incident, the Meeker massacre, as it used to be known. We're searching, we're groping for terms on how to categorize this event, because the event that was commonly known as the Meeker massacre of September 1879, well, like so many controversial incidents, it sort of depends on whose side you were on, whether it was a massacre or not. We've been trying to find good names for it that are acceptable to everyone. Sort of the White River Unpleasantness. We're still working, if you have suggestions. We prefer right now the White River incident, because it seems to represent that something important went on there. What it was exactly, maybe you can help me decide as we go along. The White River incident of September 1879 was a major turning point in the relations between the Ute Indians, who had lived in Colorado since time immemorial, and the whites who desperately coveted the Rocky Mountains, the hills and valleys of the Rocky Mountains, for all of the resources that many people felt that they could provide. I joke about it, but let's face it, it's not a pleasant incident, and it's a dark period in our history, in Colorado history, because it really represented the end of the Utes' sovereignty in the Rocky Mountains and their removal and relocation to new and more stringent circumstances. But I want to walk you through it a little bit. Before I do, how many people know something about this? Okay. Oh, great. I'm gone. Sorry. I gave this talk I was scheduled to give this talk a couple of weeks ago in Meeker, which is like Colston, Newcastle, right? We ended up not giving the talk, but I did speak with the folks at the Meeker Historical Society, and I was so relieved I didn't do it because they knew more about the White River incident than I was ever going to know. They lectured me. I know a little bit because I'm the state historian for the Colorado Historical Society, which means that I need to know a little bit about a lot of different things. I've been fortunate in that the Colorado, this is my plug, the Colorado Historical Society has just published a very nice little capsule history and guide of the Ute Indians in Colorado. This is actually, the title of it is the Ute Indian Museum, a Capsule History and Guide, because we are selling this primarily at our Ute Indian Museum in Montrose. How many people have been there? Has anyone been down there? Got to check it out. It's a really great little museum that has big plans for expansion in the future. The Colorado Historical Society has been publishing little capsule history and guides for over time for each of its 11 regional museums. This is hot off the press. It came out just over a month ago. And it's a nice little capsule history of the Ute Indians. My plug is that we sell these for $4.95. You can call the Colorado Historical Society at 303-866-3682, and for $4.95 plus shipping, you can get a very concise, and dare I say, well-illustrated history of the Ute Indians in Colorado. It's a nice little piece. So I cribbed a little from this, and I cribbed from other presentations I've given about the White River incident in the past. But I just want to give you sort of an overview and talk about some of the way that our thinking has evolved about the White River incident, not the least in the new name that we are using now for what occurred there. But I did want to give that a quick plug. To start this story, as you start any history in Colorado, you have to start with the American Indians, right? They're the people who did all of the first. They explored the valleys and mountains. They climbed the peaks. They gave names to the landscape, to the rivers and the mountains. And all of the landscape had meaning to American Indians because this was their grocery store, right? This was their commissary. This is where the Utes made their living. The land, as one Ute historian has said, was sufficient to the Utes. Everything they needed was in the landscape here, from the yampa roots that they gathered right in this vicinity, to the deer and the antelope and the bison and the grasses and their shelters and their clothing, all came from the land. The land was for hundreds, if not thousands of years, sufficient for the Utes. In the 1870s, when an Indian commissioner asked Ouray, why is it that the Utes won't transform to agriculture? Why won't you become farmers? Ouray's reply was, hunting is our business. Right? So they thought of it that way. This is what they did. This is how they survived, they subsisted, and they did very well. The Utes themselves call themselves the Nuuci, N-U-U--C-I. And the language they speak is a Uto-Aztecan language that linguists call Numic today. It's a language that's related linguistically to the Aztecs of Mexico. But where the Utes actually come from is kind of hard to say. If you ask the Utes today, they'll tell you that they lived in Colorado forever. As far back as you want to go, they have oral histories that go back thousands of years. And we have to take that into consideration. Archaeologically, we can begin to trace the cultures that became the Utes from about 1300 AD, living in the Rocky Mountains. How they got here, where they came from exactly, archaeologists are still debating about that. We're not exactly sure. For the Utes, their story is that they've always been here. They're the only American Indian tribe who was associated with Colorado that does not have a tale of emergence, a story of how they got there to where they are today. The Cheyennes, the Arapahoes, the Pawnees, the Shoshones can all tell you sort of what their path was to Colorado. The Utes don't have those stories. They were always here. The Utes were in the Rocky Mountains by the time that the Spanish arrived in the 1500s and 1600s. And it was with the Spanish that the Utes began trading with Euro-Americans. The Spanish, of course, introduced another really important condition for the Utes and when they were thinking about how they were going to occupy this region, and that, of course, was the horse. We know that Utes had the horse by the time of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, and probably they had horses even earlier. They were, in fact, one of the first American Indian tribes to acquire the horse, and you can imagine what that meant in terms of the economic capacity of the Ute Indians. Prior to the horse, all of their Their hunting strategies, all of their gathering strategies were based on the ability to move around on foot. Now, that's not to say that the Utes, didn't get around. The Utes developed an extremely sophisticated series of trails connecting the plateaus of eastern Utah with the Front Range and the Great Plains of Colorado. But the horse absolutely revolutionized the way that the Utes could travel across this countryside and exploit the resources they had available. Before Utes acquired the horse, their primary source of carrying heavy loads was what? Do you know?
Dogs.
They're on shoulders, yes, and what was that?
Dogs.
Dogs, right. And a good-sized dog can carry about 35 pounds on its back, okay? An overworked dog can carry about 35. Now, they're not carrying it on their shoulders, right? They're using travois. They're dragging it along the ground, right? So dogs are the beast of burden as well as an emergency food supply, if necessary. Horses, 500 pounds. More on a travois, 1,000 pounds, 1,500 pounds. You can now travel farther and carry more with the horse. So with horses, the Utes went from a relatively poor group of people to one of the richest and most powerful Indian tribes in the Rocky Mountain West. In fact, you could easily argue that the Central Rocky Mountains were the Utes' exclusive domain, and anyone else who came there came at the Utes' forbearance. They could tell you when it was time to go. The Spanish, who traded with the Utes, created new economic exchange systems as well, trading manufactured goods for buffalo hides and especially deer robes. The Utes would come down out of the Rocky Mountains to places like Taos and Abiquiu and sometimes Santa Fe to attend trade fairs with the Spanish. They would acquire manufactured goods, steel pots and kettles, steel knives, guns and gunpowder, which would help them, which made them more efficient as hunters in the Rocky Mountains. The Utes also, over time, began trading with the Spanish for slaves as well. Indian captives from the Utes' raids on their neighbors, they would trade these in Abiquiu and Taos in exchange for manufactured goods. So there was this very thriving slave trade that went on for hundreds of years before the first Americans arrived on the scene. When the Americans did arrive in the 1840s, what they found was that there was already a pretty sophisticated connection and diplomacy between the Spanish and the Utes. The United States took over what is now the Rocky Mountain West and the American Southwest after the Mexican-American War of 1848-1849. The Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo of 1849 ceded the Rocky Mountains and everything below the Arkansas River to the United States. But what do these treaty lines mean to the Utes exactly? Not much. The Utes felt that really all that had changed was sort of the languages of their trading partners. And the Utes, the southern Ute bands, the Capote and Muache Utes, signed the first formal treaty relationships with the United States in 1849. They promised to end this raiding for slaves. They promised to formalize their trade relations with the U.S. They promised not to attack wagon trains and supply trains coming across the Santa Fe Trail. All seemed well and good for a number of decades. In 1859, of course, the Pikes Peak Gold Rush took place, and that's when the Utes really had to start being careful about their relationships with the United States, because as gold miners began to filter into the Rocky Mountain looking for gold and silver, they began encroaching on Ute hunting grounds and Ute lands and Ute resources as well. And friction began to take place between the Utes and these American prospectors who began to come in the 1850s and 1860s. And the American reaction was something that, a refrain you're going to hear again and again throughout this lecture, which is the Utes must go. The Utes need to leave. There were maybe between 3,500 and 4,000 Ute men, women, and children in all of the Rocky Mountains. And what Americans began arguing by the 1860s was that the Utes simply couldn't use the resources as efficiently as Americans could. Why was it people like Frederick Pitkin, Colorado's second state governor, or William Byers, the editor of the Rocky Mountain News, would argue, why was it that 3,500 Utes are controlling 20 million acres of land? How efficient is that, is what the Americans would have argued. If Americans could go in and exploit the gold and silver, extract the mineral wealth from the mines, open up ranches and farmland in the Rocky Mountains, that land would be used more productively over time than if these few, and this is a term the Americans would use, these few wandering savages were just aimlessly trolling through this landscape. That didn't seem an efficient use to many Americans. So it was not long before the United States government began negotiating with the Utes for land cessions in the Rocky Mountains. The first of these cessions took place in 1863 during the Civil War, when the territorial governor of Colorado, John Evans, opened up negotiations with Utes in the San Luis Valley for the cession of that valley. That negotiation of 1863 really characterized some of the misunderstandings that Americans and Utes were going to have with each other over the coming decades. For one thing, something that Americans never really warmed up to is the idea that there are 7 different bands of Ute Indians, right? From the Yaparikas who occupied this area all the way down into southern Colorado, when the Capotes and the Moaches and the Weminuche Utes occupying sort of the border between Colorado and New Mexico. 7 different bands who don't always necessarily see issues eye to eye. And American negotiators never really cottoned up to the fact that when you're negotiating with one Ute band, that doesn't mean that band necessarily speaks for all of the other Ute bands. This was a problem in the San Luis Valley negotiations in 1863 because about 1,500 Tabawatch Utes showed up, but none of the other bands arrived. And the Tabawatch Utes agreed to the cession of the San Luis Valley, but that wasn't necessarily part of their land. That was land that was claimed by the Capotes and the Moache, all right? So it looked good on paper, right? You got the treaty. But you also have leaders of the Capotes and Moache saying, what is this? This is our land. The Tabawatch don't have the right to give away our land. Well, this is a tactic that the United States had already perfected by the Civil War, which was find the willing Indians and negotiate with them and represent that they represent all of the interests of the other bands, whether they do or not. So once the United States began to get a taste for negotiations with the Utes, of course this was going to continue. And in 1868, the United States summoned a delegation of Utes, this time representing all 7 of the bands, to Washington, D.C. to negotiate for the cession of all lands east of the Continental Divide. This was a very important treaty negotiation for a number of reasons, not the least of which is because it really represented the emergence of a Ute leader who would be very important in what we're talking about today with the White River incident. This gentleman on, let's see, that would be your left, Ouray, familiar with him, I'm sure, right? And with his wife, Chipeta. Ouray is a fascinating character in Colorado history. One of the greatest Coloradans who ever lived, I would argue. But I would also argue in that next breath, one of the most controversial Coloradans who ever lived as well. Ouray's really celebrated today. We have, of course, a town in the San Juan Mountains called Ouray, Colorado, and maybe we'll talk about why that is. He was universally celebrated by Americans as the chief spokesperson for the Ute tribes. In fact, he was designated by the United States government as the supreme chieftain of the Utes. He had almost no support among the Utes for that designation. Okay? The Capotes, especially, and the Moaches of southern Colorado said, this guy does not speak for us. They said it loud, they said it clear, and nobody ever really heard them. Well, what was it about Ouray that made Americans love him so much? And they did, and I'll explain how in just a moment. What was it about Ouray? Well, Ouray's an interesting cat. He grew up, actually, his father was an Apache. His mother was a Tabawatch Ute. He grew up on a ranchero in northern New Mexico near Taos. He learned to speak Apache, Ute, Numic, I should say, Spanish, and ultimately English with equal fluency. An extremely eloquent, a brilliant public speaker, a very persuasive public speaker as well. A man who can make an eloquent case, a turn of phrase, a man who seemed to know how to do business too. When the American negotiators began speaking with Ouray, it was clear that he was going to try and strike a deal. Now, he was going to strike a hard bargain when he could, but he really did what he could to get the best deal that he thought was possible for his people. So in 1868, a delegation of Ute chieftains are summoned to Washington, D.C. to negotiate the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. Ouray is among them. They take them to New York, and they take them to Central Park, and they show them the zoo at Central Park, which includes caged bison and elk and pronghorn and antelope. And they take them to Washington, D.C., and they show them a military review of thousands of American soldiers marching back and forth. And Ouray takes us all in, and he goes, you know what? There are only 3,500 of us. If we choose to fight, we will fail. We cannot possibly survive as a people by resisting the United States government. So he began thinking in very pragmatic terms. He began saying, what is the best deal that I can get from my people? If we have to give up this land, what can we do to get the best that we can? And so he went to the treaty negotiations of 1868 and drove a very hard bargain, indeed, with the United States. This well-spoken, this, as Americans saw him, civilized chief of the Utes stepped forward and said, we are not going to give away the eastern two-thirds of our territory in Colorado without some stipulations. He wanted to make sure that the Utes received a $100,000 annuity payment for 15 years, so $1.5 million. He wanted to make sure that there were treaty goods involved that would be the Utes, dispersed to the Utes from the United States government to the Utes by treaty each and every year. 2 different Indian agencies that the Utes could go to, and that they would be protected in perpetuity in their land in the western third of Colorado. That land would be Ute land, inviolate, a place where white miners could not go, where if white miners came, the government would guarantee that they would send soldiers to kick the miners out. That otherwise, if soldiers came into Ute lands, that would be seen as an act of war. And Ouray received all of these cessions to his treaty in 1868. The Treaty of 1868 is considered by many historians and diplomatic people who pay attention to the diplomatic relations between Indians and the United States government as one of the strongest ever negotiated on behalf of Indians. And yet, for all that, it only lasted just 5 years. Ouray's original idea was what he proposed originally was that the whites come in and take all the gold and silver they wanted. He wanted the whites to promise that they wouldn't stay and build buildings, that they'd go home when they were done. Didn't quite work out the way that he wanted. But it was also Ouray who said that agreements the Indians make with the government are like the agreement a buffalo makes with the hunter after it has been pierced by many arrows. All it can do is lie down and give in as well. Ouray returned home in 1868 and enjoyed his peace for about 5 years. In 1872 and 1873, new silver strikes in Ute territories in the San Juan Mountains led for clamoring for a new treaty with the Utes to cede the San Juans as well. Prospectors who infiltrated the western slope had a lot of trouble whenever they went into the San Juan Mountains looking for gold and silver in places that would later become Telluride and Ouray and Silverton. Well, they'd be met by the Utes who said, I'm sorry, you have to go now, and if you don't go, we'll make you wish you had. Or the Ouray or other Ute leaders would go to the United States government and say, you need to send soldiers to protect our boundary. Right? So United States soldiers were deployed from garrisons like Fort Garland in the San Luis Valley to the San Juans to patrol and make sure that trespassing miners didn't go into Ute Indian lands. You can imagine how well that went down, right? In a democracy, with Utes don't have vested rights in the system, the white settlers and the white miners, what are they going to do when the government shows up to evict them from the lands? They're going to write their congressman, right? They're going to write the governor and say, you can't do this. We're the Americans. We're the taxpayers. You've got to do something about the Utes. The Utes must go. So in 1873, the United States government once again summoned Ute leaders, including Ouray, to Washington, D.C., to make another round of negotiations. The government, as it turned out, was totally helpless to stop the infiltration of prospectors. And so they negotiated another treaty with the Utes, this time ceding 12 million acres, the land of the San Juan Mountains. The Utes, again, under Uray, received the maximum concessions they could get. Even Uray was disgusted by this one. He came back and he was furious in Washington, saying, how much more? When is this going to end? Exactly. And his initial bargaining position was, we will not cede another acre of land. But he also knew that that really wasn't possible. Uray, by the way, I should say by 1873 was under significant pressure by the Ute tribe to stop the negotiations. Other Ute leaders who were very dissatisfied with Uray, very distrustful of him and his agenda, and who felt that he was giving away too much too soon, or that he was giving anything away at all, were actually plotting to replace Uray with other contenders. In fact, in that period between 1868 and 1873 and into the 1870s, other Ute leaders plotted to assassinate Uray. Uray actually had to defend his own life at gunplay. He shot a couple of men, killed them, who came after him to murder him and displace him as the, if you will, universal spokesman of the Utes. So a lot of contention, a lot of controversy. And it did not help that in the treaty negotiations, both of 1868 and of 1873, that Uray received bribes from the United States government. I'm sorry, a salary from the United States government. His good friend Otto Mears, the famous road builder of the Rocky Mountains, the pathfinder of the Rockies as they call him, very good friend of Uray's, also attended these negotiations, and he went to the commissioners and said, Uray would be a little more amenable to your side if you paid him an annual salary. And so they did. They included a $1,000 salary for Uray, and they also set him up in a model farm in Montrose, a place where he could set an example to show other Ute Indians how you could be a farmer. And Uray prospered there. He did very well. He had Mexican servants. He had this beautiful oak desk. When whites came by, he dressed in this nice suit. When he was working, he would dress in his buckskins. He did great there. While the other Utes were displaced and starving and suffering, the, if you will, universal spokesman seemed to grow richer and richer during this period. So you can maybe see why he's something of a controversial figure, certainly among the Utes today. Well, the Bruno Agreement of 1873, say what you will about Uray, he had at least managed to get the maximum concessions from the United States government when the government agreed to honor those concessions, that he could. And he had done it all without shedding a drop of Ute blood. So you could argue that, given what he had to work with, that what Uray had achieved was nothing less than a victory for the Utes. But back on the eastern slope of Colorado, and certainly in the mining camps, newspaper editors and businessmen and politicians and settlers and miners kept alive this idea that the Utes must go. Newspapers such as the Rocky Mountain News, my favorite newspaper, because whatever nasty, horrible thing is going on, the Rocky Mountain News was usually supporting it. Rest in peace, I should say. We're going to miss it for all that, because now all we can do is rag on the Denver Post over there on the eastern slope. But they printed false stories about massacres of hapless white settlers by Ute raiding parties, and reformers lectured about the wasteful economy of the non-productive Utes. And as more silver strikes were found, this time in the Roaring Fork Valley, in places like Aspen, that drumbeat for Ute removal continued to grow. Well, in the midst of all this, we have to add another factor. A man named Nathan Meeker. Are you familiar with this guy? He's one of those guys, the more I know about him, the more I'm absolutely transfixed by this individual. He is a paradox wrapped in an enigma for me. I'm still trying to figure this guy out. He's so tough to really figure out what's going on with this guy. In some ways, in some superficial ways, it's really easy to see what's going on in Nathan Meeker's world. He is a man on the make. He's upwardly mobile, a man who's grasping for the American dream, but he has a bold dream, a bold vision of what the United States could be, a vision based on ideals of reform and education and hard work and cooperation and temperance. Except maybe for that last one, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Nathan Meeker, how about this guy, Nathan Meeker? Born in Ohio. He grew up always wanting to be a writer. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a writer. He wanted to be a novelist. He adored Herman Melville and Thoreau and Emerson, and he thought that that's what he wanted to do. And he published exactly one novel in his life, The Adventures of Captain Jack Armstrong. Anyone read it? Anyone? What? No, no one's read the cat.
Well, we know about
All right. Well, yeah, no one's read it because it's awful. Okay, it's terrible. But the plot of it is, when you know something about Nathan Meeker, it's absolutely transfixing because it's about a naval captain who's planning to take missionaries to the Pacific Islands, and they bring along Bibles and farm implements and about 200 pounds of opium, because it turns out Nathan Meeker was a pretty heavy-duty opium user. He said it was his best friend and his worst enemy all at once. And they go to the Pacific, and the ship wrecks on coral rocks, and they end up on an island that just has these idyllic natives who know nothing about private property and nothing about civilization and nothing about agriculture and values of the West. And Captain Jack Armstrong goes to educate them on all of this, to convert them to Western ways, to teach them about enterprise and private property ownership and clothing, for heaven's sakes, and Christian values and hard work and all those wonderful things. And you know what happens in this novel? The whole thing falls apart. The minute that they get private values of private property, they become greedy and grasping and self-interested and self-involved. And they start fighting with each other and they start murdering each other. And the whole society collapses under the weight of Western civilization. And Captain Jack Armstrong simply walks away. Okay? He builds himself a boat and he leaves the island, realizing that his attempt to civilize the savages is a failure. What? Well, we'll get, all right, let's just get on to this, all right? Nathan Meeker wrote this one and only book, and he was a failure as a novelist, but he was a pretty good writer for all of that. And during the Civil War, he began writing war correspondence about the campaigns in Kentucky and along the Ohio River Valley. And it caught the attention of the most prominent newspaper publisher in the United States at the time, Horace Greeley, the publisher of the New York Tribune. Okay, the best read paper in the United States in the mid-19th century. Horace Greeley was reading Nathan Meeker's dispatches, and he was so impressed that when the war was over, he wrote Meeker and said, "Why don't you come work for me?" And Meeker began writing about agriculture. I forgot, there's one other thing about Meeker that you should know, which is that in the 1840s and 50s, he was involved in a failed agricultural settlement, a utopian agricultural settlement called the Trumbull Phalanx. It was based on the idea of Fourierism. Fourierism was an idea of social reform in the 1830s and 1840s based on a really radical idea, sharing. Okay? A revolutionary idea, that it's good that people share with each other. And Meeker had joined this colony in southern Ohio in the 1840s, very enthusiastically saying that socialism is what we need. We need to cooperate with each other, that we pay people according to their needs, and we produce according to our ability. And this is the wave of the future. And the whole thing collapsed in about a year. And Meeker ended up stopping, he quit going to meetings, and he began to think, well, you know, the problem with this system is when there's no personal incentive, when there's no property, if you will, then nobody really wants to do anything for themselves. Why am I working for your benefit? Okay? What are you doing for me? Well, nothing. So all the intellectuals came and nobody wanted to actually dig ditches, and it fell apart. And he was completely disillusioned with this idea of Fourierism and socialism. But the idea of reform and cooperation, that people still should pitch in together for the common good, was an idea that was very strong with Meeker. And he took this with him wherever he went. He certainly took it with him when he went to the New York Tribune and became the agricultural editor for Horace Greeley's paper. And he was amazingly good at writing very technical, or taking very technical agricultural ideas and making them accessible to a general public. And he worked for Greeley for a number of years at the end of the war. And in 1866, he and Greeley began to concoct a scheme to create another utopian agricultural colony in the West. Meeker would head this up. And he would go out somewhere and find some land somewhere in the West, and he would create a colony that was based on the values of cooperation. Not socialism, but cooperation. That we all own our own property, but we're going to pitch in together on some community projects for the common good. Most specifically, irrigation. We're going to get irrigation to our crops no matter what it takes. We're going to base this on hard work and education. And most of all, temperance. If anyone wants to sign up, I've got some tracts. Temperance. No alcohol. Water's going to flow freely, but liquor not at all, through his utopian colony. And he handpicked the applicants for this, okay? He sent out advertisements in the New York Tribune, which everyone was reading, and particularly farmers in the depressed upstate New York area, but also in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana, all applied to be members of this new, what he called the Union Colony. And Greeley had the opportunity of handpicking the 150 best of them. What a great opportunity. He can choose. So you don't have to worry that all the intellectuals are going to show up, right? Because Meeker is going to make sure that the blacksmiths also come and that the ditch diggers also come. And he's going to make sure that there's a cross-section of the kinds of jobs that they need there. It's guaranteed to succeed. And then he picked the site in Greeley, what is now Greeley, Colorado. You ever been there? Well, here's the thing about Greeley, Colorado. When Meeker got there, it was, as every American imagined Colorado, the Great Plains of Colorado to be, it was the great American desert. There were no trees there, just some scraggly little cottonwoods along the South Platte and the Poudre River. That's it. You get up on the benchland, flat, right? Treeless, absolutely treeless. Can you imagine these Easterners coming from places like Illinois and New York and Pennsylvania and stepping out of the Denver Pacific Railroad train in Greeley? Not a tree. Well, I guess if you're a farmer, that's a good thing, right? No stumps to remove. You're not going to spend all day, every day, removing these dad-blasted stumps. But, well, Annie Green, who wrote a memoir, was a Greeley pioneer, and she wrote a memoir. She called herself a Union Colony victim. Kind of gives you a sense of what her attitude was. She wrote a memoir called 16 Years in the Great American Desert in 1886, and she talked about how they were on their beautiful farm in lush western Pennsylvania one day with her loving children around her, and her husband came in, barged into the kitchen and said, "Honey, we're selling the farm and we're moving to Greeley, Colorado." And she claimed she immediately sunk into a chair and burst into tears. And the next scene is her sitting in a tent on the wind-blasted prairie of Greeley, Colorado, still in tears, with her husband out looking for a lot and her children all gathered around her going, "It's okay, Mommy, we'll be going home soon, right?" It was, from her perspective, even in 1886, when Greeley was actually a green town and was prospering, she said it wasn't worth the sacrifice. What we gave up to come from our lush homes in the East to come out here into the great American desert simply was not worthwhile. Not everybody agreed, mind you, but many people did feel like she did. A lot of people were really upset about Nathan Meeker, too, in Greeley, I should say, although he launched some successes. He began building homes, and since they didn't have any trees, do you know what he used?
Sod.
Good guess. Adobe, right? Which, that far north, is something you don't really think about, right? But he noticed what Hispanos were doing in southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, and said, we've got to use this sun-dried mud. Nobody builds adobes that far north now. It was a radical idea. His house, built in 1870, two-story adobe home, still stands in Greeley today. You're not going to find a lot of other adobe homes dating from that far back, that far north in Colorado. He did get the ditches built. They originally planned 4 ditches to snake out of the Cache la Poudre and South Platte rivers. They were the first ditches in Colorado to actually climb up, use the contours of the land to climb up onto the bench lands to get out of the river valleys. A first for Colorado, for Nathan Meeker, to irrigate the bench land. And although the Union Colony during his time only built 2 of those ditches, it was enough to get farming going. It was enough to get trees growing, houses and little green lots going. And if you go to Greeley today and you don't mind the smell, look around. It is a green, tree-filled city because of the irrigation that Nathan Meeker provided. Okay, he had a bold idea to take the great American desert and transform it into a garden, and that's just what he did. Whatever else you say about him, he did that. Okay. Personally, it was a total failure for Meeker. He invested in a lot of real estate there, and to do so, he borrowed heavily from the Horace Greeley family, from Greeley, and lost a lot of money. And the settlers at Union Colony were so upset about his mismanagement, because he really didn't know what he was doing as an agricultural manager. He was a visionary, right? He was an idea guy, not a detail guy. That they fired him as the leader of Union Colony after the first year. So looking out for another job, he tried different things. He wrote some more articles. He began going on the lecture circuit. He owed a lot of money to the Greeley family, so he spent a lot of time trying to cook up schemes to pay back those debts. And he began also writing about his experiences in the West. And among those experiences were encounters with American Indians. And Nathan Meeker, who, if nothing else, really was sure of himself no matter what he encountered, began writing articles about what he deemed the mental inferiority of the American Indian. That's a quote from him. And drawing on his sketchy knowledge of Indian culture, he concluded that he was particularly well suited to teach the Utes Christian work ethics and the advantages of agriculture. Captain Jack Armstrong, right? Meeker approached this task with a strongly held belief in his own ability to create an agricultural utopia among the Utes. Well, what did the Utes think about this? Meeker never asked. He wasn't really interested in their opinion. He was, if he had asked, he would have found that the Utes were not universally opposed to agriculture. Farming was not, in so many words, part of the Ute experience, but they had been managing wild plants since time immemorial. The Yaparika Youths, who were right through here, the Yampa River. Yaparika is a Ute name for two wild tubers like potatoes that grow through this region. All right? The Utes had been harvesting those, but also finding plots where they could plant seeds and go away for a while and come back, and if they found the right soil conditions, they were like kind of commuter agriculturalists in that sense. They would leave to go hunting, and then they would come back and harvest. Utes in southwestern Colorado had adopted sheep herding and goat herding. As herdsmen, the Utes were all, because of their contact with the Spanish, had charted some successes. There were some individual Utes, such as Ouray and other influential leaders, who were willing to give agriculture a chance. But by and large, the Utes' attitudes about agriculture was that it would never replace their main subsistence of hunting deer and elk and bison. This was the Utes' business, right? Nathan Meeker also addressed his task, and he was finally, when he was appointed the Indian agent for the White River Agency, actually about 25 miles south of Meeker today, it moved, and we'll get to that. He also brought to this task an acute cultural insensitivity. He did not understand the Utes. He did not care to understand the Utes. It was the Utes' job to understand him and what he wanted from them. He got off on the right foot with the Utes, because the Utes at the White River Agency in northwestern Colorado had an Indian agent that they were very unhappy with. Their annuity supplies had been held up in storage in Fort Rawlins, Wyoming, because corrupt middlemen were waiting for bribes to release the goods. The Indian agent at the White River Agency had no ability to get these goods released. Nathan Meeker went to the warehouses in Wyoming and managed to get the annuity goods released. So when he showed up with long overdue annuity goods to distribute to the White River Utes. Great start. He soured that good feeling almost immediately by insisting that the Utes call him Father Meeker. Okay. Establishing the hierarchy here, right? You're the children, I'm the dad. You do what dad says, right? Well, that's Meeker's idea of what a father should do. And he certainly insisted that the Utes follow along. He forbade the Utes from bartering on their own with white traders who were on the borders of the reservation for goods like guns or cloth or cooking utensils or whiskey. You know, he felt he had the Utes' interests at heart, but remember, the Utes have been trading with European Americans for hundreds of years by this point. Meeker said, no more trading. Everything you get, you will get from me or from the sweat of your own brow. No more of this trading back and forth. And then he did something very controversial, as the Utes saw it. He unilaterally moved the Indian Agency. Okay? The original location of the White River Agency, some 20 or so miles south of Meeker, was a horrible place. Everybody thought it was horrible. The Utes thought it was horrible. It was dark. It was secluded. It was in a deep valley. The sunlight never got in there. It was rocky and barren. They called it the rat hole. Meeker was unhappy with this location because it was completely unsuitable for agriculture. And what does he want to do? He wants to make sure that the Utes become farmers. Well, they can't become farmers on the land where the White River Agency was, so he moved the agency unilaterally, without consulting the Utes, to a new location, to the site just a few miles to the west of modern-day Meeker, Colorado today, in a beautiful valley. Have you ever been there? It's particularly gorgeous right now, I have to say, because of all the rain we've been getting. If you go there today, oh, it's breathtaking. A broad, flat valley full of grassland with the White River meandering through the middle of it. You go there today, and aside from the fences, it probably doesn't look really different than the way the Utes saw it in the 1800s. There are big herds of horses in this valley. And this valley, known as Powell Park, was a place where the Utes had pastured their herds for decades. It was a lush grassland. It was sort of like the High Plains West out there in this valley, a place where the Utes could come, they could gather their horses together, especially in the winter time. They could keep their horses there, keep them fed until the summer came and the spring rains came again, and they could move out and hunt again. It also looked to Nathan Meeker like ideal farmland. And so he moved the White River Agency to this new land. Some of the Utes refused outright to participate in this move because they knew what Meeker had in mind for the land. And as far as they were concerned, the first, last, and only use for Powell Park was as a horse pasture. In fact, the Ute bands associated with the White River Agency split into two groups over this move. Some of them stayed in the old place, rat hole or no. They weren't going to follow Nathan Meeker on some lunatic folly of farming. Some of the other Utes said, okay, we'll at least give it a try. The really important thing about that split is that it was the younger chiefs and sub-chiefs who stayed behind. Men such as Nakagat, or as he was known to the whites, Jack, was a very, very talented young Ute leader who, like Uray, was multilingual. He had served as a scout in 1876 in the Rosebud campaign in the wake of Custer's last stand. He had served as a scout for the United States Army against the Sioux. He had been raised in Utah by Mormons. Okay? A man who understood Americans for good or for ill. And he said, we're not going. Okay? Other Utes, led by an older and more established leader, a man that the whites called Douglas, went ahead and moved with Meeker to the new site, to the new agency. It was at this agency that Meeker really put his plan in place to tamper with the Utes' traditional life. He forced Douglas's band to plant by withholding their annuity goods. Okay? Goods which every single Ute believed was theirs by treaty right. It was by law, their goods. Meeker said, well, you can only have these on the condition that you plant and you harvest. He particularly held food back from the Utes, sort of coercing them into planting through methods that included starvation. He required that the Utes, that entire family units, show up to receive their annuity goods because he didn't want the men off hunting while the wives and the kids were picking up their goods and their groceries. And the final straw was when Meeker began tampering with the Utes' horse herds. Meeker never understood the importance of horses, the centrality of horses to Ute culture and to the Ute economy, right? Horses were tools. Horses were the means by which Utes acquired their sustenance. A fast horse was a valuable commodity because it represented the speed with which a Ute hunter could capture a deer or an elk or a buffalo. To that end, Utes showed off their hunting prowess in Powell Park by organizing horse races. In fact, they had an established racetrack in Powell Park where they would go and they would race and they would gamble and they would have a good time, and Meeker could not stand it. He thought that it was dissolute. He particularly was opposed to the gambling that went on there. He thought that this was everything that was wrong with the Utes right here at these horse races. They don't want to work. They don't want to farm. They want to hunt, which he considered a leisure activity, right? And they want to gamble. And so he plowed up the racetrack. When he ordered his men out, his employees out to plow up the racetrack, they were shot at. Right? In fact, if you want to see the plow that he used, it's at the Meeker Museum right now. The plow is right there. It's one of the most astonishing things I've ever seen, because it was, this one object was right in the middle of this incident. Right? The men quit. The employees at the agency said, "Okay, we're not going to get killed for this." Meeker went to the leaders of the Utes at the agency, men like Douglas, but also a holy man named Kanala, whom the whites called Johnson. Yeah, isn't that great? Kanala confronted Meeker in his office. Kanala said, "You cannot plow this up. You do not understand us." Nathan Meeker. And Meeker gave Kanala sort of a stiff lecture about restraint and about propriety. And then they began exchanging angry words. And finally, in a fit of impatience, Kanala grabbed the elderly Nathan Meeker and picked him up and physically ejected him from his own office, threw him out into the dirt, out into the compound of the agency. Sort of wiped his hands and walked away. It was his way of saying to Nathan Meeker, "You're fired, okay? Send someone else. This is our land. You don't tell us what to do here. This is our land. You represent our interests. You do not lecture us. You do not try and change our way of life. You're done." Meeker saw it as a direct threat on his life and his well-being. And so he immediately telegraphed to the governor of Colorado, Frederick Pitkin, and to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, saying that the Utes were about to stage an unrest, and that the agency employees were in danger, and to please send troops. Well, for Colorado's for Colorado's state governor, Frederick Pitkin, this was really a dream come true, because nobody was beating the drum for Ute removal more than Governor Pitkin, for whom Pitkin County is named, right, where Aspen is. And Pitkin, in fact, had a lot of mining interests in the San Juans and expected to get more if the Utes were simply moved out. So he called on the government as well to do something, and he went so far as to say that if the United States government does not send troops to eject the Utes, then the Colorado militia will do it themselves. We'll raise a militia, and we will, this is what he said, kill every man, Ute man, woman, and child. Okay? Well, the government responded by dispatching 3 companies, about 150 men of mounted soldiers from the garrison at Rawlins, Wyoming, to investigate and to aid the agent Nathan Meeker if necessary. They were commanded by Major Thomas T. Thornburg, Tip Thornburg, a man who had received his rank and his advancement more by the people he knew than by any particular accomplishments that he had done. He'd only been involved in one military campaign. That was the campaign against the Cheyennes of the late 1860s, when he led his garrison out into the sandhills of Nebraska and immediately got lost. Could not find his way back. Finally, soldiers from the 5th Cavalry came and found him and led them back to the garrison. And he saw this, his appointment as the commander at the post in Rawlins, he saw this as just sort of something he had to get through in order to get back to Washington, D.C. I mean, you can kind of tell what sort of campaign Thornburg thought this would be, in that he brought his hunting dogs, he brought his fishing rod and reel along, okay. A lot of cigars, a lot of brandy. It's kind of a country sojourn for Thornburg as he went out. And most of the troops were bored out of their minds, and they were delighted with the prospect of getting out of the garrison and getting out, taking a ride out on the plains, camping out for a little while, fishing if possible. We'll check this thing out, we'll clear up the Ute business, and we'll get back home. What they really weren't thinking about was how seriously the Utes took the charge that United States troops crossing into Ute territory was seen by the Utes as an act of war. Forewarned of Thornburg's approach, the Ute sub-chief Nikaga, Jack, and a small band of Utes went out to the boundary line, Milk Creek, to meet with the soldiers. There was some trading posts right on the border, right? Sort of like if you live in New Hampshire and all the liquor stores are in, you live in Massachusetts, all the liquor stores are in New Hampshire, right? Same sort of thing. There are these trading posts. They sell whiskey to the Utes. They sell guns. They sell other goods to the Utes. Nikaga goes to the store and he waits for Thornburg to show up. Thornburg comes into the store and Nikaga comes out of the back room and says, "We need to talk. I know that you're sending these troops to the agency. We know that Nathan Meeker called for you, but You cannot bring these troops into Ute lands. Here's what Nakagak proposed. He would take he and 4 of his followers would join Major Thornburg and 4 of his subordinates, and those 10 would all go together to the White River Agency to investigate Meeker's claims. Fair enough, right? Well, maybe not. Thornburg felt that his orders were explicit, that he was to take his command to the White River Agency and investigate. So he told Jack no. So the troops crossed over the Milk Creek, and almost immediately encountered a force of about 200 Ute warriors. Thornburg, to his credit, started to do the right thing. He set up defensive positions. He was caught in a terrible spot. The valley that he was in was very low. It was along the creek. The Utes had gotten up on the high ground all around. They surrounded him on pretty much every side. He was totally exposed. He had no cover, but he circled up his command, got their horses in a defensive position as best he could, and then rode back to bring the wagons up, the supply wagons, which had been lagging behind, about 2 miles away. As much as anybody can tell, that Major Thornburg's plan was to make a show of force and then negotiate a withdrawal with the Ute leaders. But he never got his chance, because on the way back to the supply wagons, a Ute sniper shot and killed him. He died about 10 or 15 minutes into the battle. Command devolved to a wounded subordinate, and the soldiers hastily erected barricades out of boxes and horse carcasses and dug shallow rifle pits, and quickly found themselves besieged by the Utes. Meanwhile, back at the White River Agency on that same day, Meeker was holding a conciliatory lunch with Kanala, trying to make peace. But when word that the army had crossed into the Ute territory, many of the Utes panicked. It had only been 15 years since the Sand Creek Massacre, Colorado militiamen attacking an unarmed camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians in southeastern Colorado. And for the Utes, this event was still fresh on their minds. So many Utes began packing up their families to flee. Others began getting their weapons together to fight. When Meeker tried to get Douglas to dissuade his people from going to join the fight against Thornburg's command, the old chief simply shrugged his shoulders and walked away. Later that afternoon, a band of scared and angry Utes entered the White River compound and began shooting the government employees. The first of all was a young employee from New England who was up on one of the agency buildings fixing the roof. The Utes just went up and shot him off the roof. Another agency employee had bragged previously that he had killed 9 Cheyenne Indians during the wars of the 1860s. He was the next to go. Meeker's family, his wife and his daughter, and the wife of another agency employee and her 2 children ran to the ice house, where they sought refuge with another wounded government employee. At one point, when they were running out of water, the employee tried to get out to get them water and bring it back, and he was shot and killed by the Utes. Fearing that the ice house would be set on fire, the women surrendered. Arvilla Meeker, Nathan Meeker's wife, was told to go into the agency and retrieve the cash box. When she went in there, she found the slain body of her husband laying on the agency floor. The women were spirited away, and some of the younger Utes took Nathan Meeker's body out into the compound, and then they kind of sent a message. They took a spike and they drove it through his mouth into the ground. It was later explained that was some of these Utes' idea of a joke, that this was the only way they were going to stop his lying tongue from wagging. At Milk Creek, a couple of scouts managed to slip through the Ute lines and make their way back to Rawlins and to Steamboat Springs for reinforcement. It just so happened that some Buffalo soldiers from the United States 9th Cavalry were in Steamboat Springs on patrol at the time. The story goes, and this is maybe apocryphal, that they rode out of town to the west and they found a stick stuck in the fork of the road with a note in it saying that Thornburg had been killed and that the 5th Cavalry needed their help. And so 37 African-American Buffalo soldiers rode to the rescue, and it wasn't enough. They too quickly found themselves besieged, but they provided possibly the reinforcements that prevented Thornburg's command from getting overrun. And they held out together in a 6-day battle, the longest battle between United States soldiers and American Indians in American history. 6 days. And it's kind of funny because we know for a fact that some of the members of Thornburg's command went into that battle as dyed-in-the-wool racists, and they came out of it as real proponents of civil rights and equality. When these Buffalo soldiers came to their aid and shared their hot and dusty and uncomfortable and dangerous positions behind the carcass of dead horses, well, as one of them said later, when you sit next to a man in the dust with bullets flying overhead for 6 days, it doesn't matter anymore what color his skin is when you pass the water bottle. Right? It isn't until 6 days after the battles that a larger force, a stronger column from Rawlins, Wyoming, finally arrived to break the siege. The Utes withdrew, leaving behind 37 dead. Thornburg's force lost their commander and an additional 12 troopers in the battle at Milk Creek. They were buried on the spot, and I'm sure many of you have been there. You can go there today. There are 2 monuments there now, one to the slain United States trooper and another to the slain Ute warriors who were in that battle at Milk Creek. Well, the aftermath of this incident was both better and worse than the Utes could hope to expect. You can imagine what word of this incident does to people in places like Aspen or Ouray, which had been named by the settlers there to kind of conciliate Ouray and keep his will good to what they were doing there. Aspen completely fled. Everybody in Aspen left. They went over to Leadville. They said, we're not staying there while the Utes are on the warpath. Panic absolutely gripped Colorado whites. And Coloradans redoubled their cries that the Utes needed to leave and that the ringleaders of this, what they called the massacre, needed to be punished. In Washington, D.C., however, cooler heads prevailed. The United States Secretary of the Interior was a German immigrant named Karl Schurz. And Schurz authorized not a military reprisal, but a peace commission, which included some of the more popular Indian agents that the Utes had had, as well as Ouray, to go and investigate exactly what had happened and try to bring some order out of this chaos. Led by Ouray and a former Indian agent named Charles Adams, the commission negotiated the release of the hostages who had been taken at White River. Their story is an interesting one, too, and it's a little unclear exactly what went on. When asked immediately afterwards, Arvilla Meeker and Nathan Meeker's daughter and Mrs. Price and her children all said that they had been treated well. Later, a few months went by, and suddenly Arvilla Meeker and her daughter were out on the lecture circuit talking about their mistreatment and the outrages, that's their word, the outrages they suffered at the hands of the Utes. They kind of tell different stories, so what exactly happened, I'm not sure we'll ever know with any certainty. Ouray, for his part, persuaded the commission to move the hearings not away from Denver, where political outrage was so intense that the delegation of Indians who were going to Denver to participate in the hearings, they took the train from the western slope to Pueblo, and when they got into Pueblo, whites met them at the station with rocks and rotten apples, stoned them, and threatened to hang all of the Utes. They made their way to Denver, and Ouray said, we cannot get a fair hearing here. You need to move this commission to Washington, D.C. And due to his persuasion, it was relocated to neutral ground. There, Ouray eloquently argued that the blame for the massacre lay at the feet of both sides. But he did defend the Ute leaders by arguing that Thornburg's force had violated the treaty and therefore saved the northern Ute leaders from trial and execution for murder. And yet, what the whites in Colorado called the Meeker Massacre created the impetus to remove the Utes from the western slope once and for all. Within a couple of months of the incident, 1/3 of all United States troops in the country were either on the borders or inside Colorado, gearing up for a Ute war. It was the war that the Utes were absolutely not going to give the United States. And in 1880, Congress forced a treaty on the Utes restricting their tribal lands. The Utes, the Uncompahgre Utes, and the Yaparika Youths, who were then known as the White River Utes, were moved entirely out of the state to the Uinta and Ouray Reservation in northeastern Utah. land that had been previously the Uinta Reservation. The Utes of Colorado, the northern Utes of Colorado, will receive some compensation, some annuities in exchange for their agreement to move out of the state. The Uintas, on whose reservation they moved, got no compensation at all for suddenly having all of these new guests living up beside them. And there were cultural frictions between these two bands of the Utes that are still unresolved even to this day. The southern Utes, the Mowache, the Weminuche, the Tabawatch, the Capotes, were moved into the far corner of southern Colorado, into a strip of land 15 miles wide by 100 miles long, known as the Consolidated Ute Reservation, pushed all the way down to the corner of their former lands. Today, that reservation has actually been split into two reservations, the Southern Ute Reservation, which has the Capote and Mowache band, and the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, which houses the Weminuche band of Utes. A tiny sliver of their former domain of the Rocky Mountains was all that the Utes received. Well, this story spells the end of Ute control of the Rocky Mountains, but it does not, by any stretch of the imagination, spell the end of the Utes as a sovereign nation, as three nations today. The northern Utes are the Uinta-Ouray Reservation Utes of Utah, the Ute Mountain Utes, the southern Utes of southern Colorado, are still here today. They would argue, I believe, that what people like Nathan Meeker and certainly Frederick Pitkin tried to do was eradicate them as a people, commit genocide. That's not too strong a term for what Pitkin had in mind. And they survived that, compromised in having to negotiate more than they wanted to negotiate away, certainly, but still alive, still thriving, and stronger today than they were even a century ago. Thank you.